How did a small group of colonies on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean become one of the most powerful nations in modern history? The story of the United States is not just a story of wars and presidents. It is a story of ambition, conflict, innovation, and contradiction. A nation built on the ideas of freedom and equality. Yet, a nation that spent centuries struggling to live up to those ideals. To understand America today, we have to go back to the very beginning. In the early 1600s, Europe was competing to expand its influence across the world. England wanted new resources, new trade routes, and new territories. In 1607, a group of English settlers arrived in Virginia and founded Jamestown. It became England's first permanent settlement in North America. But survival was extremely difficult. The settlers faced disease, hunger, and conflicts with Native American communities. Many died during the first years. The colony survived mainly because settlers discovered that tobacco could become a profitable crop. As tobacco production expanded, more English settlers arrived. Over time, more colonies were created along the eastern coast of North America. Eventually, 13 colonies were established. But these colonies were not all the same. The northern colonies developed around trade, small farms, and religious communities. The southern colonies relied heavily on large plantations and enslaved labor. Different economies created different ways of life. And from the beginning, one of America's biggest contradictions was already forming. The colonies talked about liberty, while millions of enslaved people had none. For much of the 1700s, the colonies remained under British rule. At first, many colonists considered themselves British citizens. They traded with Britain, followed British laws, and benefited from British military protection. But everything began to change after a major war. From 1754 to 1763, Britain and France fought for control of North America. Britain won, but the war left the country deeply in debt. British leaders believed the colonies should help pay the cost. So Britain introduced new taxes. The colonists saw things differently. They believed they were being controlled without having a voice in government. Their argument was simple: no taxation without representation. Tensions continued to rise. In 1773, a group of colonists protested British control by throwing hundreds of boxes of tea into Boston Harbor. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with stricter laws, instead of calming the situation. The punishment pushed the colonies closer together. In 1775, fighting broke out between British troops and colonial militias. The American Revolution had begun. At first, the colonies seemed to have almost no chance. Britain had one of the strongest armies in the world. The Americans had limited supplies, little military experience, and no powerful navy. But they had something Britain could not easily defeat: the desire for independence. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Written mainly by Thomas Jefferson, the document announced that the colonies were no longer part of the British Empire. It declared that people had natural rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words became the foundation of American identity, but they also revealed a major contradiction. At the time, slavery still existed. Women had few political rights. Native Americans were being pushed off their lands. The promise of equality existed, but it was far from reality. The Revolutionary War continued for several years. The turning point came when American forces defeated the British at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. The victory convinced France to support the American cause. French money, weapons, and soldiers helped change the balance of the war. Finally, in 1781, British forces surrendered at Yorktown. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. The United States had won independence. But winning a war was easier than building a country. The new nation now faced its biggest question: how should it govern itself? The first government system was weak. The central government had little power. It could not effectively collect taxes, control trade, or solve national problems. Many leaders realized the country needed a stronger foundation. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia and created the United States Constitution. The Constitution established a system based on three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The goal was to create balance, so no single person or group could gain too much power. A few years later, the Bill of Rights was added. It protected basic freedoms such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to a fair trial. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. The American experiment had officially begun. But the young nation was still fragile. It had to build an economy, protect itself from foreign threats, and decide what kind of country it wanted to become. And beneath the surface, a major conflict was already growing. Would America become a nation based on freedom for everyone? Or would it continue relying on a system that denied freedom to millions? That question would shape the next century of American history. After gaining independence, the United States entered a new stage. The biggest challenge was no longer defeating an enemy. It was deciding what kind of nation America would become. The young country was surrounded by powerful nations, and its future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: America wanted to grow. In the early 1800s, the United States began expanding westward. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made one of the biggest land purchases in American history. The United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France. The deal nearly doubled the size of the country. A massive area stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains became part of the United States. Jefferson sent explorers Lewis and Clark to study the new land. Their journey revealed the enormous resources of the American West. It also encouraged more settlers to move beyond the original colonies. As America expanded, a powerful idea began spreading: manifest destiny. Many Americans believed the nation was destined to expand across the entire continent. They saw westward expansion as progress. But expansion also created serious conflicts. Native American nations had lived on these lands for thousands of years. As settlers moved west, many native communities were forced away from their homes. One of the darkest examples was the Trail of Tears. In the 1830s, thousands of Cherokee people were removed from their ancestral lands in the southeast. Many died during the forced journey west. The growth of the United States came with a heavy human cost. At the same time, another issue was dividing the country: slavery. As new territories joined the United States, Americans constantly faced the same question: would slavery be allowed there? The North and South developed very different economies. Northern states became more focused on factories, trade, and wage labor. Southern states depended heavily on agriculture, especially cotton. The invention of the cotton gin made cotton production extremely profitable, but it also increased the demand for enslaved workers. By the middle of the 19th century, millions of African Americans were enslaved in the South. The debate over slavery became more intense with every new state and territory. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise temporarily balanced power between free and slave states. But it did not solve the deeper conflict. The country was becoming divided over a fundamental question: could a nation built on the idea of freedom continue allowing slavery? In the 1850s, tensions reached a breaking point. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers to decide whether slavery would exist in those territories. The result was violence between supporters and opponents of slavery. At the same time, a new political movement emerged. The Republican Party was created to stop the spread of slavery into new territories. One of its rising leaders was a lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. In 1860, Lincoln won the presidential election. Many Southern leaders believed his victory threatened the future of slavery. Before he even took office, several Southern states decided to leave the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America. The country was breaking apart. On the 12th of April, 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The American Civil War began. It became the deadliest conflict in American history. The Union, led by Abraham Lincoln, fought to preserve the United States. The Confederacy fought to create an independent nation where slavery could continue. At the beginning of the war, few people expected it to last long. But the conflict became a massive struggle. Millions of soldiers fought across the country. Entire cities were destroyed. Families were divided. The war tested whether the United States could survive. A major turning point came in 1863. President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate-controlled areas were free. The war was no longer only about preserving the Union. It had become a fight against slavery. Later that year, Union forces won important victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The Confederacy began losing strength. In 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War ended. The Union survived. And through the 13th Amendment, slavery was officially abolished in the United States. But the victory came with a tragedy. Just days after the war ended, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The country had survived its greatest crisis, but rebuilding America would become the next enormous challenge. After the Civil War, the United States entered a period called Reconstruction. The government attempted to rebuild the South and create a new society after slavery. 3 major constitutional amendments changed the country. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment protected voting rights for African American men. For a short time, many Black Americans gained new political opportunities. But progress faced strong resistance. Violent groups and discriminatory laws attempted to limit these new freedoms. By the late 1800s, America entered a completely different era. The country was no longer only an agricultural society. It was becoming an industrial giant. Factories expanded. Railroads connected cities. Millions of immigrants arrived searching for a better life. The United States was entering the age of rapid growth. After the Civil War, the United States entered one of the fastest periods of growth in its history. The country had been damaged by years of conflict, but the war also accelerated major changes. Factories expanded. Railroads spread across the continent. New technologies transformed the way Americans lived and worked. The United States was becoming an industrial powerhouse. During the late 1800s, millions of people moved to American cities looking for opportunities. Immigrants arrived from Europe and other parts of the world. They came hoping to find jobs, build families, and create a better future. Their labor helped build America's factories, railroads, and growing cities. But life was often difficult. Many workers faced long hours, dangerous conditions, and low wages. In crowded urban neighborhoods, families often lived in poor conditions. The rapid growth created enormous wealth, but that wealth was not shared equally. This period became known as the Gilded Age. The name reflected the contrast of the era. On the surface, America looked rich and successful. New industries created some of the largest companies the world had ever seen. But beneath the surface, many Americans struggled with poverty, corruption, and inequality. A few businessmen became incredibly powerful. Andrew Carnegie dominated the steel industry. John D. Rockefeller built an oil empire. J.P. Morgan became one of the most influential figures in finance. Supporters called them captains of industry. They argued these entrepreneurs created jobs, built new industries, and helped America grow. Critics called them robber barons. They believed these powerful businessmen controlled markets, destroyed competition, and exploited workers. The debate over the power of big corporations continues in America today. As industries expanded, workers began fighting for better conditions. Labor unions grew stronger. Workers demanded shorter hours, higher wages, and safer workplaces. Major strikes broke out across the country. Some became violent, revealing the tension between business owners and workers. Over time, labor movements helped create many workplace protections that Americans take for granted today. At the same time, the United States began looking beyond its own borders. By the end of the 19th century, America had become one of the world's strongest economies. It was ready to compete on the global stage. In 1898, the United States fought the Spanish-American War. The conflict began over Spain's control of Cuba. The United States quickly defeated Spain and gained control of several overseas territories. The victory marked a turning point. America was no longer just a growing country in North America. It had become a global power. But the new century brought new challenges. In 1914, World War I began in Europe. At first, many Americans believed the country should avoid European conflicts. But as the war continued, German attacks on American ships increased tensions. In 1917, the United States entered the war. Millions of American soldiers were sent overseas. Their support helped the Allies achieve victory. In 1918, World War I ended. The United States emerged from the conflict stronger than before. After the war, America entered the Roaring '20s. The economy grew rapidly. New inventions changed daily life. Cars became common. Radio and movies became popular. Jazz music spread across the country. Many Americans believed they were living in a new age of prosperity. But beneath the optimism, serious problems were growing. During the 1920s, many people invested heavily in the stock market. Some borrowed money to buy stocks, believing prices would continue rising forever. But the event became known as Black Tuesday. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Millions of people lost their jobs. The United States entered the Great Depression. The Great Depression became the worst economic crisis in American history. At its worst, nearly 1/4 of American workers were unemployed. Families lost their homes. People waited in long lines for food. Confidence in the economy collapsed. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt became president. He introduced the New Deal, a series of government programs designed to help the country recover. The government created jobs. It supported banks. It introduced new rules for businesses and financial institutions. The New Deal did not immediately solve every problem, but it changed the relationship between Americans and their government. Many people began to believe the government had a responsibility to help citizens during major crises. Then, another global conflict changed everything. In 1939, World War II began after Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Once again, the United States tried to stay out of the war. But on the 7th of December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack killed more than 2,000 Americans. The next day, the United States entered World War II. America transformed its economy for war. Factories that once built cars and consumer goods began producing weapons, aircraft, and military equipment. Millions of men and women joined the war effort. American forces fought across Europe and the Pacific. In 1944, the Allies launched D-Day, the largest sea invasion in history. American and Allied forces landed in Normandy, France opening a major front against Nazi Germany. In 1945, Germany surrendered. But the war in the Pacific continued. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered soon afterward. World War II had ended. The war changed the world. Tens of millions of people had died. Europe and Asia were devastated. But the United States emerged stronger than ever. It became one of the two most powerful nations on Earth. The next great struggle would not be a traditional war. It would be a global competition between two completely different systems. The era of the Cold War was about to begin. After World War II, the United States entered a completely new era. The country had survived the Great Depression, won a global war, and emerged as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. But another major conflict was already beginning. It was not a war between armies on a battlefield. It was a competition between two different visions of the world. On one side was the United States, which promoted democracy and capitalism. On the other side was the Soviet Union, which supported communism and a state-controlled economy. The rivalry between these two nations became known as the Cold War. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union competed for global influence. They built massive military forces, developed nuclear weapons, and supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world. But they avoided direct war with each other. The fear of nuclear destruction kept both sides from launching a full-scale attack. One of the first major Cold War crises happened in 1948. The Soviet Union blocked access to West Berlin, trying to force Western countries out of the city. The United States responded with the Berlin airlift. For almost a year, American and Allied aircraft delivered food, fuel, and supplies to millions of people trapped in the city. The operation became a symbol of America's determination to resist Soviet expansion. In 1949, the United States and its allies created NATO, a military alliance designed to protect member countries. The Soviet Union later created its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The world became divided into two competing sides. While tensions grew overseas, America experienced major changes at home. After World War II, the economy expanded rapidly. Millions of soldiers returned home, started families, and bought homes in growing suburbs. This period became known as the post-war boom. Cars became a central part of American life. Television entered millions of households. The American middle class grew larger than ever before. But beneath this prosperity, America faced one of its greatest internal struggles, the fight for civil rights. For generations, African Americans had faced segregation and discrimination. In many parts of the country, Black citizens were forced to use separate schools, restaurants, and public facilities. Many were also denied the right to vote. The civil rights movement challenged these unfair systems. One of the most important moments came in 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest led to the Montgomery bus boycott. A young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the movement's most important leaders. He promoted peaceful protests and argued that America needed to fulfill its promise of equality. In 1963, King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. Millions of Americans watched as he called for a future where people would not be judged by race. The movement achieved major victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned racial discrimination in many areas. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected voting rights for African Americans. These laws transformed American society, but the struggle for equality did not end. At the same time, the Cold War expanded into a competition in science and technology. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. The achievement shocked Americans. The United States feared falling behind in science and technology, so the country invested heavily in education, research, and space exploration. This competition became known as the space race. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced an ambitious goal to send an American astronaut to the moon before the end of the decade. On the 20th of July, 1969, that dream became reality. Astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon. The event was watched by millions around the world. It became one of the greatest technological achievements in human history. But while America was reaching the moon, it was facing another difficult conflict. The Vietnam War became one of the most controversial events in American history. The United States entered the conflict to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. But the war became longer and more difficult than expected. Thousands of American soldiers were killed. Millions of Vietnamese people died. At home, many Americans began questioning the war. Large protests spread across the country. In 1973, American troops withdrew from Vietnam. 2 years later, North Vietnam captured Saigon. The war ended with a communist victory. The conflict changed America deeply. Many citizens became more skeptical of government decisions. Trust in political leaders declined. During the 1970s, the United States also faced economic problems. Oil prices increased. Inflation grew. Many Americans worried about the future. But by the 1980s, a new political era began. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became president. His administration promoted lower taxes, less government regulation, and a stronger military. Supporters believed his policies helped revive the economy. Critics argued they increased inequality. Meanwhile, the Cold War began moving toward its final stage. The Soviet Union faced economic problems. Its leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, introduced reforms. Relations between the two superpowers slowly improved. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The wall had separated East and West Berlin for nearly 3 decades. Its collapse became a powerful symbol of the end of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The Cold War was over. The United States had become the world's leading superpower. But a new era was coming. The next challenge would not come from a rival superpower. It would come from terrorism, technology, and a rapidly changing global society. After the end of the Cold War, the United States entered a new chapter. For the first time in decades, America had no direct global rival powerful enough to challenge its position. The 1990s became a period of rapid economic growth, technological innovation, and global. One of the biggest changes came from the rise of the Internet. Personal computers became common. The World Wide Web connected people across the planet. Information that once took days or weeks to access could now be found instantly. Technology companies grew rapidly, and the digital economy began changing how people worked, communicated, and lived. Companies built around software, online services, and digital platforms became some of the most valuable businesses in history. But globalization also created new challenges. Many American companies moved manufacturing overseas to reduce costs. Some communities lost traditional factory jobs. The economy became more connected to the world. But many Americans questioned. In 1991, the United States led an international coalition during the Gulf War. Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and American forces helped remove Iraqi troops. The operation demonstrated America's military power after the Cold War. But a different kind of threat was emerging. On the 11th of September 2001, the United States experienced the deadliest terrorist attack in its history. 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked. 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 struck the Pentagon. Another crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to stop the attackers. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The attacks changed America forever. President George W. Bush announced a global campaign against terrorism. The United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, targeting the Taliban government that had supported al-Qaeda. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, arguing that Saddam Hussein's government was a threat. The Iraq War became highly controversial. Supporters believed it was necessary for national security. Critics questioned the reasons behind the invasion and its long-term consequences. While America was fighting overseas, another crisis struck at home. In 2008, the financial system nearly collapsed. The housing market crashed. Major banks failed. Millions of Americans lost jobs and homes. The crisis became known as the Great Recession. The government took emergency actions to stabilize the economy. Slowly, the country recovered. The 21st century also brought a new wave of technological change. Smartphones transformed communication. Social media changed how people received information. Artificial intelligence began influencing industries and daily life. Technology connected the world in ways previous generations could never imagine. But technology also created new problems. People became more divided politically. Online platforms made it easier for information and misinformation to spread. Debates over immigration, healthcare, economic inequality, and America's role in the world became increasingly intense. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected president. He became the first African-American president in United States history. His election represented a historic moment in America's long struggle over race and equality. During his presidency, the country worked to recover from the financial crisis. His administration also introduced the Affordable Care Act, which expanded access to health insurance for millions of Americans. In 2016, Donald Trump won the presidency. His campaign focused on immigration, trade, and challenging the political establishment. His presidency changed the style of American politics. Supporters praised his economic policies and efforts to reshape government. Critics argued that his leadership increased political division. Then came one of the biggest challenges of the modern era. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic spread across the United States. Millions became sick. Businesses closed. Schools moved online. Daily life changed for people across the country. The pandemic affected not only public health, but also the economy, politics, and social relationships. In 2021, Joe Biden became president. His administration focused on economic recovery, infrastructure, and rebuilding international partnerships. But America continued facing major challenges. The country debated climate change, global competition, economic inequality, and the future of technology. Today, the United States is a nation shaped by more than 2 centuries of history. It began as 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast. It survived a revolution, a civil war, economic disasters, and global conflicts. It became a center of science, technology, culture, and economic power. But America's story is not only a story of success, it is also a story of contradictions. A country founded on freedom, yet one that struggled for generations to expand that freedom to everyone. A nation built by immigrants, yet often divided over immigration. A society driven by innovation, yet constantly debating how those changes should be controlled. The history of the United States is not a straight line. It is a series of choices, conflicts, and turning points. Every generation has faced its own challenges. Every generation has shaped the country in a different way. And the future of America, just like its past, will depend on the decisions people make next.